been hot these days, and it's in this summer heat that it's perfect that we reflect on the hospitality of Abraham. That's often what this first reading gets called in some of the tradition, the hospitality of Abraham. And the men that he hosts in the summer heat are often pictured as angels. In fact, there's this icon. It's probably one of the most famous icons, right, Eastern Catholic art of this scene, and it has an interesting name. It's called the Most Holy Trinity. In the East, they viewed the scene of Abraham hosting three angels as a scene of being visited by the Trinity, God's own divinity himself in three persons. And I went to Holy Trinity Seminary in Irving for 2 years, and in the chapel there, they have a massive copy of this icon. And so for 2 years, every day, I would stare at this scene from our first reading. Right? It has three angels seated around a table, and it's a little spooky. I don't know if you've ever seen identical triplets. It's kind of disconcerting. They all have the same face. And the only way, what they're trying to get at, God is one, right? Even if he's a Trinity. But the only way you can distinguish them is where they're seated on the table and the colors of their robes and the actions. But other than that, they all look the same. So the first one is blessing the second. The first is pointing to the second. That's the Father to the Son. And the second is blessing the food that's been placed on the table by Abraham. And the third is pointing down. And that's the Holy Spirit, saying, I'm going to go on mission down to them. It's fascinating. It's fascinating. In the East, they love the Old Testament probably more than we do. But what they're seeing here in Abraham recognizing three strangers in the heat, seating them under a large oak tree, feeding them with milk and curds and foods, and then being given the great promise of a child, something Abraham and Sarah have been waiting on a long time. What they see here is a visitation by God. And as fascinating as all of that is, in my time, those first 2 years of seminary, I realized that what I was really looking at was not just a picture of an old scene from the Bible. I was looking at a picture of my own soul at prayer. And so it is for each of us. Each of us, when we truly go to pray, play host to the Most Holy Trinity. God dwells in your soul. Right? When St. Paul is saying that's Jesus Christ in you, he doesn't mean that just in a figurative way, but really in a real way, God dwells in your soul anytime you're in a state of grace and you go to pray. You know, there's some people out there, they read the passage of Paul that says your body is a temple, and for them that means like, well, I got to get fit, and I will only ever take in kale and grilled chicken and rice and broccoli. And have you tried AG1 and, only that. But that's not really, exercising and health is great. Good on you. But that's not really what that passage is about. If your body is a temple, you are a temple, a living stone, as St. Peter says. You are a walking church. Like Mary, you are an ark of the covenant of God. And so whenever you truly pray, you encounter God in your soul. And you take in God as your most esteemed guest. And so now you might be thinking, man, Father is really going out of his way to avoid having to talk about Martha and Mary. But I'm getting there. Because even though it's an awkward scene for us, we all need to hear what Jesus says to Martha. It impacts how we approach prayer. In many ways, the scene of Martha and Mary is equally a story of hospitality and prayer. And I had a lot of joy this morning when I read that Pope Leo also preached on this theme. A lot of people will say, I'm a Martha. I'm not like those Marys. I can't just sit and be still and listen to God and rest. And maybe you feel a little bit judged if you're that way anytime this passage comes up. And you should, because we all are Marthas. We're all Marthas. Nobody is naturally disposed perfectly to simply receive God's love, because each of us deals with sin and distraction, and we live in a really noisy world. So all of us, in one way or another, are very disposed to action. And we might even imagine a third sister in this scene, the third of the triplets. We could call her a Magdalene, and maybe she's far away and she's lazy. Perhaps you find yourself there. But even then, she's occupying herself with something else. There's always something that needs attending to, just the wrong things, right? But both Martha and Mary here are playing host to Christ. Mary is hosting him interiorly, while Martha is only hosting him exteriorly. But I would suggest that Mary, in fact, also hosts Christ exteriorly, just in the right proportion. Because you can't host Christ interiorly without hosting him externally. You're going to have a really hard time praying if your room is a mess, if you haven't made the time to pray, if everything around you feels hectic. It's probably hard to play host to Christ in prayer. Just like, if you had an esteemed guest coming to your home, it would be hard to host them if you felt like everything in the house was chaos. So you have to tidy up. You have to, take care of all the practical things if you're going to pray well. If you don't want to pray, you're not going to pray. If you don't take the practical steps to make time for prayer, you're not going to do it. You can try, but it's going to be very, very difficult. So Mary couldn't sit and listen to Jesus if the house wasn't already tidy. And it's at this point that I have to say thank you to all of our sacristans and servers and lectors and acolytes and deacons and music ministry, everybody who makes it possible that we can all gather here and pray together every week. Because your ministry allows us to enter not just exteriorly into worship, but interiorly into worship. So thank you. But imagine, you've made your time to pray in the morning. You've got your Bible and your coffee and your rosary ready to go. Maybe you listened to a podcast before. And then you spend the next hour of prayer tidying up. You check your phone, you make sure the day's in order, you do everything but pray well. Sometimes, for some people, I find this can look a lot like saying a lot of prayers while there's like a really kind of heavy thing going on in the background, and you just refuse to acknowledge the thing that God probably wants you to pray about, right? Saying prayers is not necessarily praying, right? Sometimes you need to speak to the Lord heart to heart. And prayers, by the way, on the other hand, they keep us regular, right? They keep us moving, and they give us something firm to hold on to. Even further than all of that, in prayer you have to not only speak, but you have to listen. Jesus speaks truly to Martha when he says, "Martha, Martha, you are anxious and worried about many things." He knows exactly what's going on in her heart. Sometimes we judge other people and we assume that we know why they do or they don't do certain things. We think that they've got it all figured out. But our perspectives are so limited. But God is the one who's talking to us in prayer. God knows our hearts perfectly. He knows exactly what each of us needs. He knew exactly what Martha needed. When he calls her out here, it's not just, "Oh, Jesus, you're making her feel bad." No, Christ is speaking directly into what she really needs. And so it goes for each of us. Pope Leo loves to quote St. Augustine. He's one of my favorites as well. And to a group of nuns recently, he recommended a book of Augustine's called The Teacher. And in The Teacher, Augustine reminds us that external teaching must always lead to an encounter with the internal teacher, who is Jesus Christ. In other words, you can do all the prep work, but if you are not listening to the Lord who speaks to you, you will not know him. Only Christ knows your heart perfectly. Augustine has another great line. He says, "You are more interior to me than I am to myself." God knows you better than you know yourself. And so you have to encounter him in prayer if you want to conquer all of the things about yourself that you find so difficult and so troubling. God knows what you need, and he will provide it for you in prayer. So practically then, for all of us Marthas, what are we to do? How do we become Marys? I think the answer in many ways comes down to silence. This is a world full of noise and distraction. We need external silence from all of that, but even further, we need internal silence as well, so that we can listen to God speak. Silence is something hard-won. You have to really, really work for it. And on top of that, it can be really uncomfortable to spend time concretely in silence, without distractions, without anything. Oftentimes, when I'm praying a holy hour, probably 30 minutes are spent just trying to focus. But that's the price that we're paying. That's a fight for interior silence. When you find yourself distracted in prayer, okay, keep going. So I encourage you to persevere in silence if you want to hear the voice of God. For each of us, it'll differ for, all of the various causes of our life. If you've got 5 little ones, it's going to be hard to find the silence. You got to make time, But, frankly, if you spend, an hour, 2 hours scrolling on your phone every day, you probably have time to pray. Okay. Get up early if you have to. And then once you settle into prayer, it's okay to just sit and adore the Lord, to be his host, to listen to him. You don't have to have everything figured out. God is the one speaking to you. And in time, you will come to know that the Lord is present, and you will become more and more acquainted with his voice, able to hear and receive all of the good plans he has for your life. So let us now turn to the altar so that we may encounter and greet our most beloved guest in the Eucharist.